Garfield? Oh, Garfield.
Like a lot of you, I grew up totally obsessed with the Garfield comic strip. But as an adult, I've seen many people refer to it as one of the most soulless, least funny things to ever be put on the printed page. I'm not sure if I fully agree with this, but I certainly think that there was some magic to early Garfield comics which has since totally evaporated. And since today marks the 40th anniversary of the very first Garfield comic, I wanted to go through the history of the character to discuss when the country fell in love with him, when the passion was gone, and how we grew too complacent to break it off.
Hi there, I'm John Arbuckle. I'm a cartoonist, and this is my cat, Garfield.
Hi there, I'm Garfield. I'm a cat, and this is my cartoonist, John.
Our only thought is to entertain you.
Feed me.
If I were to try and pitch Garfield as a concept to someone for the very first time, this is how I would put it. Garfield by Jim Davis is about John Arbuckle, a lonely and pathetic bachelor. John has no style, he has the worst people skills imaginable, and he spends most of his days venting about his personal issues to his cat. That cat, Garfield, is the only person who actually loves John. Or at least, that's what John presumes. In actuality, Garfield is a cat. Garfield loves himself and he desperately needs attention from John, but Garfield is secretly apathetic and extremely embarrassed by John's antics.
I suppose you want to know how my date went with Liz the vet. Well, don't ask.
I won't.
She didn't show. Old John got stood up.
I don't want to hear about it.
You know, Garfield, I like you better than people.
Tell me more.
What should be emphasized is that, from the start, Garfield could not actually talk. This is why he speaks with thought bubbles. Garfield is merely thinking of commentary for everything around him. Because of this, it's become quite an infamous detail of the comic that if you remove Garfield, or even just Garfield's thought bubbles, the comic is mostly about John Arbuckle going on depressing rants at absolutely nobody.
Garfield, why don't women like me? They all say, "Oh, John, you're so nice. You'll make someone a wonderful husband," but I'm never right for them. Why, Garfield? Why?
You have to remember that John's career is that of a freelance cartoonist, which actually explains a lot of his lifestyle. He spends all of his time around the house, his main connections with other people seems to come from classes he takes or vet visits, and he has abysmal people skills. In other words, I think Jim Davis was just writing what he knew. And by the way, when I say that John has bad people skills, I mean it.
Why won't you go out with me, Doctor?
Because I hate your guts?
Does this mean marriage is out of the question? How about a date, Doc?
No way.
Great. See you at 8.
If you can't convince him, confuse him.
Well, that joke didn't age well. That comic is actually followed up by the one where he's sad that she didn't show up to the date, which I think actually makes it funny, because John is the punchline. One of the first major changes to the Garfield strip was the introduction of Lyman, John's Linus, and his housemate. Lyman also brought with him a spotted dog named Odie, who became Garfield's arch-nemesis and closest friend. Lyman living with the cast created a briefly unique dynamic for the strip, where John was actually talking to someone other than himself.
What are you doing tonight, Lyman?
I'm gonna catch the new flick down at the Bijou. It's about this kid who puts a tack on his teacher's chair, and she sits on it.
Not much of a plot.
I suppose not. But I still enjoy the movies where the boy gets the girl in the end. 4-ply, steel-belted, radial retread tenny pumps. Hi, John.
Hi, Lyman.
I'm starved. What's to eat?
Nothing. I'm eating the last of the food.
Lyman is a bit of a fan favorite, but Davis eventually realized that his audience was not invested in stories that were not completely focused on Garfield. Because of this, Lyman was eventually demoted from main cast to occasional cameo, and then he eventually disappeared from the comic altogether. Because of this, Jim Davis would begin to try and think of increasingly contrived reasons for why Garfield would always be with John, so he could continue writing about the life of John without losing the audience who seemed merely to be invested in the cat. Suddenly, John was bringing Garfield shopping, he was taking him on vacations with him, he was bringing him to dates. John, stop bringing your cat to dates. That might be problem number one, buddy. Why would you do that? For better or for worse, people come to Garfield for Garfield. So let's talk Garfield, and how he's changed. When the comic series originally started in 1978, Garfield was nothing more than a regular house cat. Sure, the idea of a cat detailing his motivations is alien to the real world, but he still acted like a regular feline. He claws up the furniture, he begs for food, he fights the dog, he sleeps all day, he can't decide if he wants to go outside or not, he constantly bothers John for scratches and cuddles, etc., etc. Jim Davis allegedly grew up on a farm surrounded by cats, and you could tell that he had a stockpile of commentary to make about them. However, Jim Davis eventually started to slip in little gags about how Garfield was a little bit peculiar as a cat, a sort of parody of the ever-constant boundaries between real life and the comic industry.
I'm just your average, ordinary cat. For instance, I'm crazy about nature's most perfect food, lasagna.
Now where could my pipe be?
Hello, what's this? A teddy bear? A dumb, stupid, silly-looking old teddy bear. I think I'll call him Pookie.
Why can't you be like other cats, Garfield? Let me explain the basic differences between humans and cats.
Well, make it snappy. I have a tennis lesson in half an hour.
After 40 years, Garfield has become such a series that's so heavily built off of its most basic of concepts that it's sort of bizarre to see the comic written so self-aware. These details were added in to mock the status quo of what Garfield was expected to do as a cartoon cat. But after 40 years of those same gags being retold over and over and over again, these feel less like strips and more like the Ten Commandments. A staple of Garfield humor is a basic joke being introduced and then retold over and over and over and over and over again, to the extent that it just loses all its power. The best example is probably Garfield kicking Odie off the table, but I would argue that for every setting or character in Garfield, there is a running joke just as overplayed as that. The best thing about post-peak Garfield humor is when the writer, whether that be Jim Davis or a ghost contributor, would try to replicate the success of early Garfield by introducing something that falls flat on its face. Oh boy, when I think of the best Garfield recurring comedic character, I think of Stretch the Rubber Chicken. You want to know my favorite Garfield catchphrase? Well, hell man, I'd have to go with something like, I hate February. No, I changed my mind. Actually, I want to go with, oh no, it's Splut Week. As the Garfield strip itself continued to evolve, Garfield himself went through a sort of Darwinistic change in appearance. First by getting much smaller and eventually figuring out how to stand on two legs, followed by the growth of two huge human feet. Ironically, over the years, the more fit that Garfield has looked in his appearance, the more likely it's become that people are going to call him fat for some reason. Garfield isn't fat anymore. This cat has had a major glow-up and no one has the compassion to tell him. Around 1981, Garfield creator Jim Davis moved his key focus away from the comic strip and towards taking control of Garfield's merchandising with the creation of Paws Incorporated. You can certainly tell that this was the period of time where Garfield started to be a lot more clean, a lot more straight-lined, and a lot more, well, commercial friendly.
Fans, please.
Mr. Garfield, welcome to Embassy Suites Hotel.
This is great. I need my space.
And of course, you'll want to take advantage of Embassy Suites' free breakfast.
Food.
At Embassy Suites, you don't have to be a fat cat to enjoy the sweet life.
This was the time period where Garfield started to appear widespread in marketing and television specials, and this is the Garfield that most people fell in love with, myself included. Watching through these old specials is a blast. They managed to capture the tone, plot, and characterizations down to a T.
Hey, I tell you what, let's get out of this place and grab a cup of coffee somewhere, okay? This way, Marie.
Well, let's give him a hand for trying.
However, the transformation of Garfield from a 3-panel comic into a series of longer specials led to the disastrous misunderstanding which, in my eyes, became the biggest problem for modern Garfield. That being that Garfield the cat needs to do stuff. It seems like these days, Garfield, the character, spends so much of his time on screen going on these grand adventures, and it never works, and it always feels awkward, because Garfield is not a character who is designed to be invested in anything. When he's illustrated wanting to go to Australia to save Lyman, or space to help a bunch of superheroes, it doesn't feel like him.
We were talking about if we were going to do a Garfield skit, it would just be John being like, "We gotta save the universe, Garfield," and Garfield being like, "John, I'm a cat."
The Bill Murray cat who hides in ventilation shafts and gets involved in some sort of prince-cat mix-up, that is not my Garfield. My Garfield does nothing but sit around the house all day and silently tell John Arbuckle that he's a pathetic nobody.
You know what, Garfield?
You need a life.
I need a life.
Yep.
There's more to life than socks.
There's underwear.
Now, the Bill Murray Garfield movies might be the best representation of someone not understanding why the comedy of Garfield works, but to me there is another special, perhaps not as bad, but a special which most clearly represents the devolution of the character. 2007's Garfield Gets Real was the first animated Garfield feature in over a decade, and it was the first televised Garfield material to actually be written by Jim Davis since 1991. So what you'd expect is that the movie would match the tone and setting of the 1980s Garfield specials. But it actually takes a very bizarre perspective on showing us these characters. Garfield Gets Real is not about Garfield the cat living in John Arbuckle's house and having misadventures with his friends. Garfield Gets Real is about Garfield the actor who plays himself in a comic, but he thinks the comic has gotten stale and he wants to quit and do something else.
You seem to be depressed.
I'm just tired of doing the comic strip. Going through the same routine every day, hearing the same tired jokes every day.
The whole special revolves around him trying to escape the place where comics are made to get to the real world, only to realize that comic land is better, and he eventually gets back. This is a discussion of the Garfield character that should appeal to adults the most, but it's clearly made for like 5-year-olds, and it's really ugly and actually hard to listen to because of all the weird sound effects they add in just to distract the kids. So I really can't recommend this one, but that's not the point. Isn't it sort of fascinating that the character of Garfield is so abstract and meaningless that they can remove everything about his story other than his ability to make quips about lasagna, and people are fine with it? That they can create a totally different meta-universe where we see comics being produced, and we see comic characters serving as actors, and Garfield, the comic strip actor, says that his comic sucks, and they can just slap the logo on and sell it to kids and no one gives a shit. You know those Tom and Jerry movies that are quite infamous, where they take actual movies that already exist and they reanimate them with Tom and Jerry awkwardly inserted into the scenes? That's what Garfield cartoons always remind me of. All these poor filmmakers go out of their way to try and insert this orange cat into places where he doesn't belong, almost for the sake of justifying the fact that he's popular. Garfield always feels like the least important facet of whatever film he's in. And that's mainly because he's really not designed to be anything other than just like a fat cat that occasionally says funny stuff. The unfortunate fact about Garfield is that since the mid-1980s, his comic strip has been the least important thing to his brand. It's been pointed out that at this stage, they could just stop making the comic and Paws Incorporated would still be making a lot of money entirely off of merchandising. So what we have here is a guy who grew up desperately wanting to be an artist, desperately wanting to make comics, desperately wanting to entertain people. Then he makes the most popular comic strip of all time. Then he makes a merchandising company to help sell the character in the comic, and then he realizes the comic is dried out and stale, and he prefers to focus on selling the character because he's a good businessman. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you can go from a comic like this...
I hate normal. I think I'll clean his clock. Hey kid, how'd you like to play on this waffle iron?
Bug off!
I guess I'll have to use more subtle means.
...to a comic like this.
I see by my watch that it's time to...
Wonder why I'm wearing a watch. Oh God. Despite all that, am I the only one who finds the continuous presence of Garfield to be sort of comforting? This is going to sound absolutely bananas, but as I grow older and I continue to have life experiences that totally change my perception of the world, it's sort of nice to occasionally turn around and see that Garfield is a constant that will never burn out. The last time that I was super invested in Garfield was around 2007, and during that time period, John and Liz had admitted to each other that they had mutual feelings, and they decided to go steady, thus ending a 28-year arc about John the cartoon bachelor. And for some reason, whenever I tune into a modern Garfield strip and I see some sort of joke about the fact that John and Liz are still dating and are still very happy, I think it's kind of wholesome. It's like logging into Facebook and seeing a picture of that one couple that somehow made it work after graduation. I've been staying sort of semi-caught up on Garfield for about the past year, and I think a lot of the strips are too juvenile and repetitive for me to admire, but I will say this. I think that this is the hardest that anyone has tried to make Garfield good for a very long time. I mean, you have to feel bad for the people still trying to work on this thing, because as of today, we are on comic 14,611, and you try and make something funny after doing it 14,611 times. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that Garfield is tired. Garfield is more miss than hit these days. Garfield easily peaked probably 6 years into production. But I do not want to live in a world where Garfield does not exist. I thought I would end this video by showing you guys a piece of fan art I made of Garfield when I was very young. As you can maybe see here, it depicts Garfield getting into a suit of his own fur and saying, "Av there's leg costumes too many." For the longest time, I forgot what this comic was about, but I recently remembered. So there is this deep cut comic where you see Garfield bending over, then you see like a rip sound come out of his back, and then he says,
"I think I need a bigger catsuit."
And for some reason, 4 or 5-year-old Quinton came to the conclusion that this meant that Garfield still looked like what he did in 1978, but that throughout the years he was being forced into progressively smaller Jax Film-style suits of himself. Thus, have these costumes gotten small around the legs? Clearly I was setting myself up to be the next Claude Monet. But yeah, that's Garfield, a series that once had a lot of artistic merit, but is now just a ploy to sell you plushies and occasional collections where they edit out Garfield to let you fully soak in the existential nightmare that is John's life. Thanks for watching!
You know, Garfield, John and I have been seeing each other for a while now.
I won't hold that against you.
And during that time, I think he's really grown as a person.
As opposed to a platypus?
I mean, when we were first dating, he used to embarrass me on an almost daily basis.
Really? Not hourly?
It's nice to see how much he's matured since then.
Poor Liz, poor naive Liz.
I'll be out on the front lawn performing my interpretive dance to Mr. Spring.